Hello and welcome. My name is Rachael Jolley. I'm the editor-in-chief of Index and Censorship magazine. Thank you all so much for coming out on this cold January evening and making it a New Year's resolution to be here with Index and our fantastic guests. We're here to launch the latest Index and Censorship magazine. For those of you who don't know, Index is a quarterly global magazine. We cover freedom of expression issues and censored writers around the world. We have a fantastic group of contributing editors in places like Turkey, Argentina, Brazil, China, who write for us, as well as lots of different reporters and also great fiction writers. And this issue, the big theme was about our macho leaders who are so sensitive that they want to close everyone else down and not hear anybody else criticizing what they're doing. So you may think there's a lot of material there. We certainly did. And we looked at countries as diverse as Brazil, India, China, Hungary, Poland, many, and you can imagine, some of you will be starting to imagine, oh yeah, they've got some things in common. Generally, we're looking at things like closing down the media or stopping the media or coming up with investigative stories or stories that are critical of the government or even issues that governments don't like. And we've seen tactics where one of the things we might touch on tonight is, say, in Hungary, where there's a government who really doesn't like anybody saying things that are critical. And so what they've done is had pretty much all their friends buy up the media so that there's no independent voices out there. And that, you'll probably hear from some of the panelists tonight, is a tactic that's being used around the world. Also, we're seeing a crackdown on academic freedom. We're seeing attacks on the independence of judiciaries around the world. So to discuss that with some countries in particular, but then we'll open it up into talking about how tactics are being shared. We've got some great panelists here today. And just to let you know that we were hoping to have Lindsay Hilsum here as one of our guests tonight, but unfortunately, Lindsay had to go to Baghdad, where there's some stuff happening. So I thought we probably accept that as a very, very good excuse.
We decided to have a hissy fit and kill another person.
Yes, there's a lot of news happening. So we have got 4 incredible panelists here to discuss this subject. So on my far left, we've got Safa Al Ahmad. Safa is an award-winning Saudi journalist and filmmaker. She's directed documentaries for PBS and BBC, focusing on Yemen and Saudi Arabia. She's also the winner of the 2015 Index on Censorship Freedom of Expression Journalism Award. So we're a big fan of Safa's. Also with us is, on my left here, is Dora Papp. Dora is a campaigner in Hungary. She's a campaigns director at a organization, or she has been a campaigns director at an organization called AHANG, and that's probably not how it's pronounced, but it's translated as The Voice, which mobilizes citizens in Hungary on different issues. She's been a part of the campaign that's helped elect the new mayor of Budapest, who is an opposition politician and one of the most senior opposition voices talking against Orban right now. So I'm hoping we're going to hear more about that. On my right here, we have Xiaolu Guo, a British Chinese novelist, essayist, and filmmaker. Her novels include A Concise Chinese-English Dictionary for Lovers, which was shortlisted for the Orange Prize, and I Am China. And her memoir, Once Upon a Time in the East, won the National Book Critics Circle Award in 2017. And final panelist to introduce is Rob Sears. Rob is a satirist and author of humorous books, including The Beautiful Poetry of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, Life Coach. So what I'm going to do is ask each of the panelists to give a short introduction, talking about a macho leader who is repressing freedom of expression, and I'm going to ask you all to choose one. And Safa, maybe you would kick off.
I mean, it's an easy and obvious one, obviously, Crown Prince Hamad bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. And when I talk about what's happening in Saudi Arabia, I usually like to liken it to a really abusive relationship where they gaslight you, so you don't even, they try to convince you that you're not being abused, that this is actually for your own protection, for your best interest. And then when that doesn't work out, then they beat you up. And then when you try to leave and you escape from them, then they hunt you down and kill you. And as everybody knows, this is not this is not an exaggeration. The case of Jamal Khashoggi is quite a good example of how intolerant this government has been of any dissent, of any voices that are against what they want to portray of themselves and on the world stage, but even domestically. And if we're going to keep up the theme of misogyny and patriarchy, then the feminist movement in Saudi Arabia is a perfect example of how intolerant he is of internal critique of the structures of patriarchy in the state. And as we know, they just lifted the ban on driving last year. But all the women activists that were actively campaigning towards not only the right to drive in Saudi Arabia, but dismantling the basic structures of patriarchy in the state, where the control of women in everyday life is still actually mostly intact. And so all these women who had worked for lifting the ban and also changing the laws of the patriarchy in the state are now in prison. And one of the things of how intolerant and egotistical this man is before the announcement of the lift of the ban was happening, they called, the personal officers of the prince, called these women activists and forbade them to say anything, right? Not even supportive, because he wanted to have all the limelight. He wanted to have all the attention for when this happens. And because he wanted to show everyone that reform and change in Saudi Arabia can only happen from the top down. And so then there is no illusion of any woman, how dare she, to think that she could have a voice in public that could actually participate in the change, active, positive change in the country. And so what happened is that most of these women abstained from saying anything during the lift of the ban. And then he actively picked all them off, and they're all in jail, and the majority of them were put in solitary confinement. Nasima, Samar, Badawi, Lujain, of course everybody knows about her as well. Sexual harassment, abuse, torture. All of these things were used specifically against the woman because they really, I think, the feminist movement in Saudi must have been the most frightening for the state. So when women organize, it's very different than when men organize in Saudi Arabia. When women organize, you're not only working against the establishment itself and the government, you're actually trying to dismantle all the other structures of patriarchy in the state, so the religious police and all of those. And so it is actually the perfect topic to talk about Hamad bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, because also that projects outwards to how he has behaved towards Yemen, for example. And the war in Yemen is almost 5 years now. Complete intolerance, not only of that there could be, I mean, I'm not justifying the Houthis at all, this is not the topic, right? But also what they've managed to do is create the worst humanitarian crisis in the world today. But not only that's not enough, because the whole attitude of gaslighting that this government maintains, they also want to pretend that they are the benevolent king of Saudi Arabia, heads the only charity that's allowed to collect any money to save the people of Yemen. So they're both killing and saving them at the same time, and they want to be thanked for it. Actually, if you go on the ministry's feed today on Twitter, they have memes about how much money Saudi Arabia has donated to save Yemenis. I mean, if there isn't a more perfect example of gaslighting I've ever seen in my life. And so just like with the Americans when they say we had to destroy the village to save it, the Saudis are doing exactly the same thing, right? They have to destroy it to save it from itself. You know, how dare the Houthis, but now we have to kill everyone because this is unacceptable to have on our borders. So is it 5 minutes?
Yes, that's great.
I can go on, Valdie.
No, and we will allow you to go on a little bit later, but let's bring in Dora.
Yeah, with Hungary.
Who are you going to choose?
Yeah. Boris Johnson. I think it's too too soon. So for talking about him, but after your introduction, I think Viktor Orban doesn't seem so so harsh at all.
Don't say that.
We didn't get to the prison and killing stuff at all yet. But on the other hand, yes, he's. I'm just hesitating whether he's a bully or he's a macho, because I think this winter issue highlighted it pretty good or thematized it pretty good what the difference between a bully and a macho is, and I did really like that piece on how the narrative of a strong man is important in making an authoritarian leader's position fix in a country or in a region. And I think Viktor Orban is a really good example for that, when the narrative itself is changing from soft to much crucial phases. For example, with freedom of speech, or with an attack on dissents like students, academies, and other institutions or NGOs that is happening ever since he won in 2010 with a super majority, which means that his party, Fidesz, has a limitless power in parliament after changing the constitution. It's been it's more than 7 times when the constitution was changed. So all the basic human rights violations have been pretty much prepared that are happening in Hungary, and what I see as an activist on the field really threatening for not just us but for everyone who have been attacked in recent years, in the last one decade. Are those little nuances that moving from constitutional and legislative changes to policy changes in the recent years. So the second term of Viktor Orban was about attacking individuals and institutions right away, and those small amendments and rhetorical modifications, how the attacks, for example, begin in media and then go on the individual or the community level of each groups. For example, when the Roma people are attacked, when women are attacked, when refugees and asylum seekers are attacked, and building up a whole story behind it and justifying it with fake news and also the necessity of we have to be a strong nation we have to be a strong group against the others, but the problem is that the others are the same, belong to the same country, belong to the same nation, belong to the same group of people. So what this kind of leadership of Orban is really pro in is making the barricades as high as possible, not to be able to sprung over from one side to the other, and making a nation believe that they have to stay divided in order to protect their own identities and their own values. And even though in Hungary we can say that people are pro-European, we cannot say that people identify themselves with European values. And here you can see that little difference between we would like to belong to the EU, but we don't believe in European values, meaning that, for example, protecting women's rights is not on an everyday level consciousness of people, that it's a must, that we have to, we should not let, for example, changing the constitution to letting people know that the unit of the family is a man and a woman. So it means that everything else is excluded from the supported type of family in Hungary, which concludes in in a list of disadvantages for LGBT groups, for single mothers, for anyone who is thinking outside of the box. And as going back to freedom of expression, also attacking journalists recently and opposition and critical media outlets was prepared by a constitutional change in 2011, and until 2018 we reached to the point when most of the when some of the outlets were already being closed or even harassed by individuals, by extremist groups, and the government themselves, the authorities themselves. So there is a thin line, I think, where we have to be really cautious how we let this narrative divide ourselves. If you think in a community, I as an activist always think in a community, and if this community suffers and we cannot really find a new identity as a united community or as a united group of people, then populist readers really have an advantage situation.
Great, thank you. Xiaolu, where are you going to go, I wonder?
I have to confess, because my background is, I'm a fiction writer, so a novelist. I collect materials to write a novel or fiction work which somehow have certain kind of reflection or a kind of commentary, but abstract commentary on the reality. So I'll be sounding very amateur here. But I must say, for someone grew up in China, I find it very interesting in the last decade or last 10 years with a new chairman, Xi Jinping. Again, as a novelist, I read the news about our chairman. And I think he's very mysterious in a sense, because I don't want to use just kind of simple words, he is mature, whatever, those kind of words, because China is in a very different stage now. When we talk about Cold War, we always, there's Mao, there's Chairman Mao, then there's American president, and it's kind of, this is a pole, very dangerous pole, two poles in the world. How the stage would turn, how the Cold War would play out, right? 60s, 70s, or 50s, and then after Mao, it seems like, I think our chairman, the name's personality disappeared because no one dared to be a replacement of Mao. And I think Deng Xiaoping was the first leader in China. It was, again, a very mysterious character came out and say, well, we're going to put the 4 gangs in prison. We're going to change the whole system. We're going to visit America. We're going to acknowledge there's a system called capitalism exists and is successful in the world. So he was the first chairman. Well, he wasn't even chairman. He was a leader. In the 70s, he took the whole, I think, turning point of China, and I think changed the dynamics of the Cold War. And since after him, we couldn't say, there's real personality in the leadership. Later on we had Jiang Zemin as a chairman, and then after him, we had one, and then we had Hu Jintao. It's all very blurry. What is the Chinese politics? Because I think after the Cold War, I think China is has been in this kind of self-struggle to get to the place where you have a voice, or have a strength, and of course, always very negative, always in the international media. But then Xi is the first one, shows some personality, and also extremely tough with his smiles, and with very charming kind of family composition, as you know what I mean. And I think as a storyteller, I was always thinking, it's very interesting. There's a Trump suddenly, out of blue, and then we have Xi Jinping as a chairman. And then suddenly there's supposed new Cold War created because it's Trump and Xi. But we thought Cold War had disappeared 20 years ago. And I think a trade war was what has been, still is, a real tension between these two poles. And I think it's also very interesting, China's, I don't know if this is the right word, friendship with Russia. And the relationship with Putin, much more closer than before in this kind of triangle kind of world relation. So in a way, I think, he has these extremely tough ways of dealing with internal turmoil, but also very interesting, mysterious way dealing with the international conflict. And I was reading, before I came, I was reading very, very good Chinese novelist called Macho, who also lives in London. And he just finished this novel called China Dream. And it's an excellent novel. Satire, Robert would approve. A satire version of current China, how Xi replaced Mao. We suddenly have another type of, the New Age worship, which was not allowed, I mean, really, in the communist environment. It's not about person. The person shouldn't be visible. It's the face of Communist Party. It's the entity of the whole nation, state personality. But yet, suddenly, we have this new worship. So the novel, I think, is even more, much more nuanced, complex than a straightforward political report about chairman. And I thought, if you want to understand more how this personality now in China, this person dealing with the past, the communist past, the very recent past, and also the set of new vocabulary she invented, say China Dream, and for example, the old vocabulary we have, for example, harmony. During the dynasties, during the emperor's time, we use this word hexie, harmony, all that, to suggest, that the final happiness is harmony. But then now, this word is communist vocabulary almost. It's one of our goals in the China Dream, and these are all summed up very well in that novel. And I thought it's interesting, finally somehow, the communist leader is also kind of James Bond character. Before there's no personality to write about it, to play with it. So I think for a writer, for a fiction person, I found that it's very, it's a mysterious, interesting, complex time.
And Jeff Wasserstrom writes in the magazine a really interesting piece, I think, about how President Xi has these many faces.
Absolutely.
And he presents different faces when he chooses. So
it's a wonderful article.
He has this soft face, sort of uncle face, and then he has, his tougher, more macho face, and like 4 others as well that you can choose from.
I think he's very atypical. I wouldn't say, just simple, tough, macho man, because he does plays a cynical word, but maybe we should use that word. The tradition of a big Chinese poet or calligrapher, or like Mao would do,
he
that
does
time.
The whole intellectual.
So so it's an intellectual
image when he wants it.
Personality, and then this kind of global leader. Suddenly we sort of have someone has some kind of personality or character, instead of this bland symbol of Communist Party. So it's very interesting how I think sort of I'm still reading and watching it and see how it evolved, not in only domestically but globally.
Yeah. Rob, can we bring you in? Maybe you could choose a leader.
Of course.
You might choose Trump, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, as a disclaimer, I don't feel that I know very much about this topic. I'm just somebody who I read the headlines, I get really, really anxious and confused, and then I write silly books to try and make myself feel a bit better. So I thought I would talk a little bit about Donald Trump as the strongman who I perhaps know most about. And when it comes to Donald Trump and free expression, for sure you could talk about some of his policies and actions. Like he's quite bullying towards journalists. He's revoked access of news organisations that are critical to him. He said that people who burn the flag should be jailed. He's introduced regulations to make life harder for critical news sources, all of that. But for me, the thing that is really worrying is his literary voice. It's the way he uses language, and I think that's what stifles free expression the most. So I wrote this book, The Beautiful Poetry of Donald Trump, and it is, for anyone who doesn't know what it is, I've taken verbatim tweets and quotes from his speeches and quotes from his appearances on The Apprentice, and reordered them, keeping the citations of where he originally said them into poems, some of which rhyme, some of them are haikus, some of them have a little bit of a story to them. So in order to compile that work, I had to read almost everything that
You poor man.
ever
Oh
said.
my God.
Many times I had to do that as well. So on my hard drive, I have like a 200 A4 page document of all the sort of quotes that I thought I might be able to weave in. And he has got a consistent literary voice, I think, from doing that work. And by the way, while we're at Google, if anybody is here who works, I don't know if anyone's here who works for Google, but if anybody could help me to say, okay, Google, can I have a 7-syllable quote that rhymes with Putin? that would be enormously helpful, because it is painful. That's Google.
Siri has.
That's not creepy at all.
No, that's Google.
Is it?
That's because I said, okay, Google.
There you go. They're on it.
So they're listening. But I do think he has a very distinct voice. Everybody probably knows it. It's more consistent and more recognisable than that of most poets and novelists that I can think of. I don't know that that's admirable, but it is true. I've not really known him to drop character, so to speak. He's always in it. And there are lots of traits that everybody will be familiar with, like his use of repetition and superlatives, diversions, very mad branching sentences sometimes. But there are two traits that I think are important in terms of free expression. And one is that he is basically impossible to ignore, and the other is that he's basically impossible to engage with. So I think he's really difficult to ignore because he has this knack for kind of telegraphic, simple ideas that get into your head and that you can't help but respond to. You know, all the sort of stock phrases, build the wall, Barack Obama founded ISIS, they're criminals, they're rapists, lock her up. Very, very simple thoughts that you just can't help but respond to. Even if you're somebody who decides what the headlines are going to be, you can't help but respond to them and make them the focus of attention, meaning that it's tricky for other topics other than the ones that he's decided on to kind of make it into the highest levels of conversation. And then there's the other trait that I mentioned, that he's basically impossible to engage with. So as well as those very laser-focused things that he says, a lot of what he says is rambling. He kind of goes on, and he'll say things that he'll row back on the next day or the next minute without necessarily acknowledging that he's done it, or he'll say that there are jokes. So there's this sort of very thin, nutritionless soup with these occasional bullets in it, and because he's always, with this rambling, the impossible to engage with part, it's sort of difficult to take that on without seeming like without sort of, I don't know, you're lowering yourself to his level, but you're engaging with it as if it's normal speech that has repercussions, and it's not really intended to be that in the first place. So you just end up losing automatically. So those are the two traits to his tone of voice that I think we all have heard them just through reading the news. We're all familiar with those as methods, and I don't know if they are deliberate methods or it's just who he is, perhaps the latter. But I do think that it's been extremely effective against a decent, fruitful public debate in the States and worldwide as well. I'm sure every politician kind of finds the right language for their purposes, like Boris Johnson clearly does. I think Putin does. Maybe some of the other leaders we've talked about do as well. But for me, nobody's doing it more effectively than Donald Trump.
Thanks, Rob. I think all of the panelists have opened up some themes that cross over continents, and it would be good to hear from you whether you think they're deliberately being shared. Xiaolu mentioned like the different faces of President Xi. You know, there are some of these leaders we're talking about have this very strong macho leader that's front and center. Some of them come forth with a sort of much more soft image, but behind that, they're much tougher. I mean, Dora, do you think that, for instance, Orban has fans that are just copying his technique, and when they're seeing what successes he has in closing down people and closing down speeches, the different techniques he's changing, looking at things like changing the constitution, do you see other European leaders watching and thinking, oh, you know, I think we could copy that and see if it has the same effect?
Yeah, I definitely think that there is subconscious of populist leaders that is sharing information, because not just the subconscious, but I think these are methods that are really easy to copy, and information is really easy to share. And what I definitely know is that, for example, the media conglomerate that the Hungarian government is building with the pro-government media is actually copied by several European states. Austria was really keen on knowing how the pro-government media is working in Hungary, Macedonia, also Slovenia. So it's just like not just copy-paste, but I think it's a really good business as well to run an authoritarian state. And of course, his I don't know whether he, as a leader, is copied, because he definitely has a strong identity. I mean, as a father of five, as a nation builder, as somebody who is protecting Europe from the threat from outside. But he's rather one of the leaders who are trying to become really important, but rather trying to keep an even bigger and bigger territory for himself. So, yep.
Some of the kind of tactics that you talked about earlier, anti-minority actions, constitutional changes, closing down the media, or undermining public trust in the media. I mean, they're classic techniques, aren't they? I mean, you must see those in Saudi Arabia. Safa.
Yeah, I mean, the irony is, I think in the case of Hamad bin Salman, I think he's emulating all of you guys, like all of those dictators, all of the leaders like Trump and Putin and China. I mean, the first country Hamad bin Salman went to visit when he became crown prince was Russia. And so I think we are so young as a country. Yes, there's individual cult of Hamad bin Salman, but he was a nobody before his father became king. Nobody knew who he was, right? And so he had to manufacture it. And I think PR companies and bottomless money helps to create that image of the young prince millennial who stays until 4 o'clock in the morning playing PlayStation with Kushner and making peace in the Middle East, right? Like there's a really weird conglomeration of different identities put together in it. And of course, because he is the royal family, he's the absolute power in a country. And so he can be whatever he wants, and that gets emulated by everybody beneath him, right? So, for example, Saudi Arabian who was one of his advisors, who was later, because of Jamal Khashoggi, fired. But he was emulating that as well. Like the cult of personality of specific men with absolute brutality. And those people were known to actually personally be in the room when the women were tortured, right? And so to me, there is no disconnect between this machismo, patriarchy, misogyny, with how they're behaving as people in power in the state and how they're behaving towards. And they're using, I mean, because we're already a monarchy and it's an absolute monarchy and theocracy, so we've invented the rule book on shutting down dissent of any sort, right? And so we own all the media. By we, I mean the state. The state owns all media. There's no independent media whatsoever to buy out. They already own it. they control and buy many of the spying softwares like NSO to spy on anyone they want. I mean, I don't know if people who remember Blackberries in the day where everybody was on their Blackberries, and they forced BlackBerry to have their servers in Saudi Arabia because they were upset that they couldn't spy on people, right? And so blatantly did that. I mean, like the Chinese parallel to this, when we were just talking before about how Mohammed bin Salman had come and openly supported China and how they're abusing their Muslim minority, and also with Kashmir in India. So this prince is really out to support every other cult. Modi is a perfect example of machismo in India, and of creating that cult of personality of him, right? And so I think, unfortunately, there are too many good examples from Hamad bin Salman to emulate across the world right now.
And today, of course, we've seen the Russian government resign, so Putin's attempt to stay in power longer.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think, Rob, you've written about Trump and Putin, do you think they're kind of learning from each other, growing idea, almost, that's a good idea, I'll take that?
Yeah. I don't know whether it's probably. Yeah, I think for sure people I mean, Boris Johnson has learned from Trump. I think didn't he say about as a way to handle Brexit, it would be a very good thing if somebody did a Donald Trump with it. I think everybody looks to Putin as a role model. Nigel Farage, Alex Salman both said that he was the European politician that they admire the most. Well, not European, but the politician that they admire the most for his efficacy. But I guess that strong men leaders are sort of showing up the weaknesses of their institutions and making everybody else think, well, maybe my institutions are just as weak if I just push a little bit.
All right, unpick the constitution so I can do what I want.
It's exactly, I mean, what the Chinese chairman did a few years ago when he announced in the National Congress he's going to cancel this 2 years limitation of being the president and then make himself forever in that position.
Popular technique.
And that was very shocking because before that, so before 2018, he was still very sort of, a bit scary, but being respected by majority of the nation. And I think that week was really, I think it's a turning point of what, it seems like inevitable everyone become emperor. And then the whole truth come out after that. So I remember that week, this Trump commentary said, well, Chinese president did this, so he's forever. Well, one day we should give that a shot, So I remember that tweet from Trump, and it's interesting when you talk about Putin, where this come from. Suddenly the change, and I think I remember that week I felt very. It's just this kind of disillusioned, just completely hopeless feeling like, okay, finally, right, this is true manifestation power, what all this anti-corruption campaign about, right?
Erdogan did the same thing.
Yes, Erdogan is another fine example. Let's take some, let's get the audience involved. Let's take some questions. There is a roving mic. So please raise your hand if you have a question and we'll take a few questions. Come on, don't be shy. Very shy audience. Oh, look, there's one over there. So let's take that one first, and then we'll take two together. So if you could ask your question, and then we'll take this one at the same time.
Hi, this is one for Rob. Sorry. You spoke about Trump as literary character and his literary voice. Obviously, it's pretty much impossible for you to know, but how much do you think that is maybe a voice and a character, and maybe he's a different person, and sort of he knows what he's doing, or it's actually just how he is?
Right, so let's take, there's another one over here.
Where do we think we're going to be in about 10 years? Are there countervailing forces which are going to... Because, I mean, in a sense, what we've heard is that this is kind of unstoppable. So what's going to stop it?
Yeah.
Or is it really just going to take over the world? And Boris will be the next one, and Macron in France will be the one after that. And whoever comes after Merkel in Germany will be their version of it.
Okay. question. So I think, Rob, the first question is very much for you.
I truly don't know. I think the fact that he never drops character makes me think maybe this is the real guy. Like in the way that an evolutionary strategy can be successful without you having any idea that you're doing it. I think it's like that. But also he has had some sort of training from weird hypnotist characters, and so you never know. I'm not sure.
Well, isn't it weird that he is consistent? Like that's very inhuman. Like humans change and contradict themselves all the time, and
well, it's
like
the one thing about him that is consistent is his verbal style.
Yeah.
Everything else is kind of he flip-flops all over the shop.
Quite creepy. Yeah.
So let's go to the other question, which is, I think, in summary, is anyone fighting back? Are there effective techniques? Could we be somewhere else in 10 years? And I think this is a perfect one to talk to Dora about, because you've got the example of the new mayor of Budapest, who is being seen by some as, an optimistic sign that opposition politicians can get elected in Hungary, and that people are fighting back against Orban. Could you tell us a little bit about how that happened, and whether you think that's, other people can copy, learn from that?
Yeah, the black sheep and the ray of hope is in the same country, so be super envious of us. Exactly what happened in October was called. Yeah, it's called coordination of opposition parties to push back against the government and against the pro-governmental candidate who ruled the city for more than 10 years. And basically, this is the first time that people power showed that political in the political level on the level of political war or whatever how may we call it, really makes it important to take part and prove that we have to be in and have to take steps in what we believe and this was basically you pronounced it perfectly. The platform itself organized the pre-election, the primaries, the first primaries in Hungary, that helped the first step in the process of having an opposition candidate for this position. And ever since, I think how this community building around the whole campaign happened is a kind of a model for the region, for those countries who are suffering from the same oppression, like Poland and also some other examples are really Romania are really keen on knowing what coordination, basically how coordination of the opposition can help. Because as we were talking about in the break, before we just came to the panel, that cooperation is not there, not really there in everyday politics, in recent politics, because the far left hates the left and the center, and everyone hates each other. So I know that this is the old business, that we have to hate each other in order to get turfs from each other. But this is really not working, and a new method to hold hands until we reach the goal, of change, can really be taken seriously, like the Budapest example. And I think in the region, for example, in the V4 region, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland and Austria, we can see that there is really appetite for this kind of taking over, taking back, or reclaiming the field of politics from right-wing populist leaders.
And how many parties were working together? I think, was it about 11?
Yeah, it's no, it wasn't 11 parties. All of the opposition parties, basically five main parties were working together, and these were six were working together from from the far right to the left.
How did they get over their kind of antipathy to each other, which is so typical of so many countries' politics?
That was a goal that was reachable.
Yeah.
So there is a leader who was capable, and there is a method that they could believe in. So I mean, that was basically something that was working in practice.
You also had the obstacle of the very controlled media that we talked about earlier. So did you have to find new ways to communicate with people and to get words out and ideas?
Sure. This is not just seeing the worst part of the controlled and limited access to media, but also finding alternative ways, like building a membership, for example, from those ones who are ready to act. And this is basically the big advantage of a platform which is mobilizing people via emails and phone calls and via other means, offline actions, for example.
Were you able to use social media?
Yes, or also social media and mass email lists and all the tools, WhatsApp and several other, not just WhatsApp. For example, WhatsApp is not really active in Hungary, but Messenger is the one platform that most of the parties are using right now. These are combining these mobilization techniques is really working.
Yeah. Anybody else thoughts about fighting back about these against these kind of controlled environments and what might work?
I mean, the more oppression, I think it's frightening because that will lead to an explosion. So, for example, in Saudi, there has been resistance, and we're talking about organized dissent. But all of those people are either dead or in jail, or in exile. And so it's a really good question of where we would be in where will we be in 10 years? I think the feminist movement is the only one that's able, because of the nature of the resistance, is part and parcel of Saudi society. And I think that discourse has been pushing a lot of reform in Saudi Arabia, whether the government wants to admit it or not. And so I am actually more optimistic because of them, in that they cannot continue to oppress people this much to this level. How many people can you execute? How many people can you put in prison? And that will push people into exploding. Yeah. Unfortunately, as we know in the region, exploding can lead to civil war, which is, I think, where we're heading.
Yeah, I think I would argue that journalism can...
This is me optimistic.
Yeah, well done, Safa. I think I would argue that journalism can often make a huge difference. And I think we could look at what's been happening in Malta, for example, as an example of that.
Huge difference, yeah.
Because we've now seen Joseph Muscat, the Prime Minister of Malta, step down because of basically 3 years of campaigning journalism that's to bring to attention.
But that's an important...
Daphne Caruana Galizia, an investigative journalist.
But then you have courts, right? You have some semblance of separation of power. And that's the frightening thing when there isn't any of that, like in our countries, like in China, where we don't even have the illusion of separation of power. You have space to maneuver within a structure that allows you to have some sort of reform. We can't vote a prince out. A king is a king until he dies, right? And so this is where I think a slower move of social change that will ultimately have to lead to political change. Vision 2030, which is what the Crown Prince wants to introduce as reform and moving away from oil, and the illusion of that, and the change in opening society that we never thought would have been possible, right? But with zero political reform, which is very Chinese, right? We're going to be super capitalist, we're going to do all these things, and we're going to give you zero political power reform or input at all into how you are governed, right? And to me, I think China is a perfect example for Hamad bin Salman in that way, how to successfully be prosperous without giving up any of your ultimate control over the state.
So let's take maybe another question over here. Those two. Let's take those two.
I think it's excellent listen to this conversation, but I want to acknowledge what's happening in India, the uprising from citizens, Hindu citizens, Jains, Sikhs, against this Islamophobic CAA ruling by the ruling government. Now that is something which shows that democracy can really work. And we should celebrate that. And this idea that we need to go beyond this idea that believing that, this is not happening. This is happening. We're all learning from each other. And all these nations and all these macho men are learning from each other. I see this as a community within Britain, as a Gujarati Indian community, connected to Modi, that it's very problematic for ourselves because our voices within Britain are being curtailed and silenced. And when you have people like Priti Patel in power, it's very problematic because I'm from her community. I'm known her since I was a child. And the problem is with this is that they have one point of view, and it will work. We need to stop believing that this is something that won't work. The idea is to bring people together and bring them with a certain point of view which will connect everyone. But what happens is people like myself, or people who look at the world in different ways, who may look at the world, writers or filmmakers or whoever, who are actually going to be far more critical and looking at the world from the experiences of individuals who don't have a voice, whose voices are being curtailed and taken away. That is the problem here. Mm-hmm. So we need to move a huge step forward, saying, actually, look at this happening. And when we talk about 10 years' time, we know what's going to happen in 10 years' time, that it will work. But I know that a lot of people are going to be left behind. And that's what worries me. And when we talk about Saudi Arabia, exactly what you're saying is exactly the gaslighting and everything is happening within British communities. If you look at certain Arab communities, friends of mine that belong to them, or if you look at Indian communities, as I've said already, we are all experiencing that in this country. And therefore, what happens is that we completely are thrown out of our communities if we dare to speak up against these extreme abuses which occur. So the only way forward, I believe, is that, this is brilliant, but we really need to actually start from a point that's not in a disbelieving this is happening, but believing it is happening so we can actually find solutions. And rather than playing catch-up, let's play a game that we're playing equal to people. So my question after all of this is it much better to be part of these organizations? Is it better for me to be part of the Hindu community in this country, which is very problematic to me, which is at odds with what's happening in India? Or is it better for me to fight from the outside?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for your passion on that subject. Let's just take the other question as well. If you could be brief, that would be great.
Yeah. I was wondering what the panelists think the kind of ripple effects, not only on the kind of countries that have macho men as their leaders, but on the countries that either neighbour or are very close allies with, how you think having a macho man or having a populist leader, how that affects the kind of surrounding countries and how that kind of spreads out and across, whether it breeds resistance or kind of mimicry.
So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to answer one of those questions. Safa, do you want to start?
Belonging or not belonging to societies and being critical of them, obviously, I would say don't belong to a community that doesn't have that kind of respect, and I don't give a shit if they don't agree. And I think the more we pander to our societies and because we want to fit in, I think we will ultimately find ourselves outcast anyways, and so you might as well be honest with yourself. But the true question is, how do you build and organize and build alliances with people who are like-minded, and who gives a shit if you belong to the same community religiously or ethnically or whatever, because that really means nothing. This is our demise if we keep pigeonholing ourselves into these really small categories, and this is what our leaders feed into, right? Like, you're going to be isolated and outcast if you no longer belong to this society or that society, or you're not from one religious minority party or the other, and they feed off of this. So if you are self-inflicting that as well, then I think you're also listening to them. You're subconsciously agreeing that these are the categories I need to fit into, and so I would say don't. Yeah.
Thanks. Dora?
Yeah, the only thing that came to my mind listening to the first section is, or first question, is that I think being online changed a lot about how we feel excluded or not. Because if we look at, and not just a Hungarian example, but I mainly focus on marginalized group, disenfranchised communities, and in the region, and trying to build a new narrative with the campaigns, where people can identify themselves not with the ones who are stigmatized, but with the ones who are empowered. But I think being online all the time, seeing all the chaos and shit that is happening around us makes us more vulnerable to all the attacks than ever before. Because I think changing information so fast also just push us to react as fast as possible. But for example, community building and developing a society or empowering people are just processes that take decades. So it's just not like if I'm not going to stand with this community from tomorrow on, then change is not going to happen. That's something that in the long run doesn't even make a sense. I mean, if we don't have a vision of what is going to happen in the next 5 decades, and I'm not gonna talk less because these are the organic processes that should happen in order to reach change, then I would say that, okay, this is just the panic period. So, and if community is in a panic period, then whatever your good intention is, you are going to put a fire out, but you're not making any fundamental changes there. So, and also representation in the media and everywhere else, I think this is really misleading in a lot of cases, because I cannot even name a period when disenfranchised communities were more present in the media or in the public thinking ever. I mean, these are topics that were brought up in the last decades, and we feel the urge of changing everything at once. But for example, in Hungary, one of my biggest problems with building up positive narratives is that what is the sole identity that I can ask people to belong to? There is no, because culturally there is no identity like that built up. So this is something that we literally have to take to a cultural level, and not just thinking on a political level solely. And there was the other question, of course, but I think I have already talked so much.
Well, it'll be down to you two to answer the other question, if that's okay. So Xiaolu,
I think Dora's speech, the point on identity is definitely a very essential discussion. You know, I think I was very, simple-minded and clear when I was living in China about the idea of identity, as if it's something very simple, nationalized. And I think I realized immediately the idea of identity shattered, scattered, fragmented once I left the country. So in a way, I think as a writer, as an artist, it is an instinct of me not to be nationalized, or at least my voice doesn't represent a certain nation's voice. You know, there's immediate kind of getting away, escaping from the main voice. And that is something I think I share with certain community, which doesn't belong to that very geographical based or the mainstream based voice. And when you come back to the word community, and I thought it's interesting, that word, even that word, we need to be maybe a bit careful when we talk about community. You know, do you mean a specific geography or local or localized, or what about the new generation? What about the metropolitan kids? You know, they grow up in one, speak a third language, went to another 5th country. They adopt different kind of thoughts, and eventually they made themselves up from all sorts of reference. And I think, you know, that community is so modern and special. It cannot be nationalized or localized unless there's a good reason to be localized, and they refuse to be used by some convenience or the power. So I would be always very suspicious or careful to immediately belong to something, because that the power changes again once the power gains its own, or corrupted from the force, right? So I think it's always good to be alternative in a very sober way, even though sometimes it's a bit lonely. But forever, I think that voice should be heard, or you should speak about that loneliness, even that voice was not being considered at all. Yeah.
Rob, do you have any thoughts on the power of comedy to change some of these? I mean, you're using comedy
I wish.
and satire. Comedy through history has been fairly
it
powerful.
has through history. I think it's a bit harder now because a lot of the characters we're talking about are a bit cartoonish in their own right. So you can't easily create a heightened, exaggerated version of them that's more shocking or more funny than.
Although they don't seem to
people
like it
themselves.
when you make fun of them, do they?
No, they don't like it. And historically, it's been, satire has been quite powerful. So I guess they might be afraid of it. But I'm not clear that I'm seeing a lot of examples of effective comedy that's really making a difference.
Yeah.
I'd love to be more optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, just in conclusion, if you look in the magazine, what we try and do with this issue is not only just outline some of the challenges, but look at some examples where people are fighting back successfully. So you've heard from Dora about some of the gains in Hungary, but we also look at what's happened in Romania, where a 2-year-long protest has really affected a major change in government. So, I mean, I think it's important when we're exploring these issues also to be looking at what can make a difference. So thank you for that question at the back. And, we can, and learning from them about what might be effective in fighting back about any, against any pushes.
Can I interject on just the follow-up on Dora's thing? It's the importance of understanding that as in the trajectory that's really long in the resistance. Because, for example, when the Arab Spring, and they called it Arab Spring, and then they turned it into Arab Winter within a few years, as if that's it, we failed. We need to be kinder and have longer plans for how we build those kind of things, and not considering it a failure because it didn't, we didn't manage. We didn't manage to do it in 6 months.
Plus patience. I don't think that there are new ideas. I don't think that there are new models that we have to build. All the ideas are out there, but it takes time when it arrives to you, and when these models can be used. So as much as the Macho leaders are using each other's tools and tactics, the movements are using them too. So it's just like, okay, who is going to arrive there faster? That's a question. Who's going to use it much more effectively than the other? But on the other hand, it's just like, it's a matter of time and I don't know, other factors that are going to be there right on time or not.
So unfortunately, we're coming towards the end of our time. I'd like to thank all our panelists for their excellent and thoughtful contributions. I'd also like to thank our Index's Chief Executive, Jodie Ginsburg, who's going to say a word or two in a minute. Because this is her last Index event after 6 years at the helm of Index. So this is your chance to grab her and talk about freedom of expression. But I think on behalf of all the Index staff and Index supporters and award winners, we'd all like to thank her and wish her good luck in the next part of her career. Over to you.
Thank you. Is this? Oh yes, look at this enormous microphone that I've got. Yes, I'm Jodie Ginsburg. For those of you who don't know me, I've had the great privilege for the past half decade and a bit to lead this amazing organisation, Index on Censorship. And because I now know everything there is to know about dictatorship, I'm going to use the next 5 hours to tell you in great detail about our work and why you should support us. So sit tight.
I'll start the cue.
The first thing I want to say is thank you very much to all of you. You've sat there very patiently and listened to a fantastic panel and did that despite having to look at 2 enormous pictures of Donald Trump's arse for the entire time. I think that's really impressive, so thank you. I'd also like to thank Sage, who is our publisher, who've been an amazing supporter of Index for many years and who've supported tonight's event, and also to Google. I'm going to be very careful about how I talk about Google in case I start Rob's phone off and it starts answering questions for me. But, you know, if you do have any questions, you can just walk past Rob later and his pocket will answer them for you. So I'm just going to tell you a very little bit about Index on censorship before releasing you back out to the rest of the wine. You've eaten all of the nibbles, I have to say, but there is some more wine. Index has been going for nearly 50 years. We were established to publish the work of censored writers and artists and to write about them, and we continue to do that today. So we continue to publish the amazing magazine helmed by Rachael, Jemima and others, publishing the kinds of work that you won't see anywhere else, and it's a fantastic read, and I encourage you to go and buy a copy after this event. But we also campaign on issues of censorship around the globe, and that has never felt more important. It's always really interesting to me listening to people speak about the experiences of places like Saudi Arabia or China and Hungary, and to think how quickly things can change so that our own free expression can be challenged. We heard very powerfully from Ash just now about the censorship that can happen within communities here in Britain, and I think it's really important never to forget that. When I took this job 5.5 years ago, people said to me, well, we have free speech in the UK, why do we need an organisation like Index? And I am reminded every single day of how quickly and easily my speech can be taken away, how Safa's speech is taken away, how the speech of those whom we support and like is taken away, and how quite quickly you think that the people who seem to be the enemy also seem to be your friends. And that's why the work that we do is really, really vital and important. It's not just a nice to have, it's not an add-on, it's absolutely essential. And let me tell you that coming down the track are many pieces of legislation here in the UK, and I see a number of you around the room who work on this, in things like online harms and regulation of online speech, that may well come for your speech, your willingness to speak out about what's happening in India, your willingness to speak out about what's happening in the feminist community, your willingness to speak out about politics or anti-Semitism. And so it's really, really key that if you care about this, and I'm guessing that you do because you are here, and what a pleasure it is to see such a full house, then please, please consider supporting Index on Censorship. We are a charity. I know we're in a very glamorous location. We've fed you some very nice canapes, but they are all thanks to the generosity of Google, whom we are helping to service through the likes of the Google surveillance that's happening in our pockets. So please, if you do one thing when you leave this room, there is a table out there. You can join us as a member. If you join as a member, you get all sorts of additional benefits and a fabulous tote bag with a Margaret Atwood quotation on it. You also get priority invitations to our fantastic events, which include things like the opportunity, if you're interested, to attend our fantastic awards, which honour individuals, many of whom are with us, who do fantastic things fighting for everybody's speech globally. With that, I'm not going to do 5 hours, much as I would like to, because these heels won't allow me. It has been an absolute honour, and a total honour to lead Index for the last 5.5 years, and a real privilege. And somebody earlier who has worked with Index for many, many years said to me something that I think sums up why it's so important. And she said, Index is not an organisation, it's an attitude. And it really is. We believe passionately in everybody's right to speak freely, including the rights of people to speak who we fundamentally disagree with. And that is something that I hope will carry through to all of you as you go about and go back into the world outside this room and carry through in all of your work. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who's given me the opportunity, including all of the fantastic staff, to have just a little bit of time experiencing the index magic. Thank you.